Another refrain that I often hear from friends of all political ideologies that really gets under my skin is that all politicians are corrupt. Obviously, there is some truth to this. Democrats are no saints. It is just a false equivalency to say that both parties are equally guilty here. If we just look at the data at the highest levels of government, it is clear that Republicans are just more corrupt, or at the very least complicit in criminality. Let's look at this current administration, which has taken this affinity for corruption to the extreme, for sure. Not only have multiple senior members of the Trump 2016 campaign been sent to prison, including its chairman, deputy campaign chairman, his personal attorney, but also his charity was shut down and labeled a criminal enterprise, and his kids are still prevented by law to be associated with any charity. Trump University was shut down as a scam in which Trump himself had to pay $25 million in fraud claims to settle. Also, as much as Republicans try to rewrite history, Trump was impeached for quite literally bribing Ukraine to help his re-election chances. And shortly after Republicans in the Senate decided to once again look the other way and acquit him, Trump then retaliated against everyone who testified against him through a series of demotions and firings. Throughout his presidency, numerous cabinet secretaries and high-level personnel have either been forced out of office due to corruption investigations or left the White House willingly and published, tell-all books telling us about how morally bankrupt and unfit for office this dude is. Remember when he got shit for constantly promoting hydroxychloroquine to treat COVID, even after it was proven to be ineffective? Well, it should come as no surprise that Trump and a close friend of his have financial stakes in the company that actually makes it. And that's, again, just one of many conflicts of interest that this fucking grifter has as president, and still has. And we don't know him all because he refuses to release his taxes, even though the IRS says there's nothing holding him back from doing so. Trump has also prioritized loyalty in government to himself and not the Constitution. I remember early on into his administration hearing news reports about him literally requiring people to sign loyalty pledges and thinking that this was kind of the end of it, a blip on the radar. But his obsession with expecting different levers of our government, not just the DOJ, to act on his direct behalf quickly became a significant issue that I think is overlooked by a lot of folks. For example, he pressured the U.S. Postal Service to go after Amazon on multiple occasions because he didn't like the Washington Post coverage of himself, which is owned by Jeff Bezos. He also fired numerous inspectors general for investigating his family and people close to him. He tried to host the G7 summit at his club in Florida. He advertised his wife's jewelry line on the White House official website, and his properties have received over $8 million in taxpayer and campaign donors' money for bullshit like $3 glasses of water. Again, Trump loves to campaign on draining the swamp, yet his administration hired 4 times the number of corporate lobbyists within its first year than the Obama administration had hired in 8. I could go on and on here, but the point is that any one of these headlines would literally be the biggest scandal for any president, yet Teflon dumbass has always managed to walk away unscathed. And that's because Republican voters and politicians either refuse to acknowledge the seriousness of these scandals or they just don't care enough to make a big deal about it. The rest of us just sit and watch in momentary shock only to move on to the next inevitable scandal. And look, I know Trump is somewhat of an aberration here, but this simply just does not happen to any similar degree under Democratic administrations. From 1961 to 2016, during which there were 5 presidents from each party whose combined administrations were equal in length, there were 120 indictments, 89 convictions, and 34 prison sentences for individuals associated with Republican administrations. That is 38 times the number of individuals convicted of a crime and issued prison sentences while working for Democratic administrations over the exact same period of time. I mean, sure, Bill Clinton was impeached for lying about a blowjob, but does that really compare in any way to what we've seen Republican presidents do? They love to create this narrative of defending the rule of law, yet they were fine with Nixon secretly urging South Korea to refuse any peace negotiations offered by the Lyndon Johnson administration because Nixon would give them a better deal if elected. Johnson knew this at the time, by the way, and just like Obama knew about Trump soliciting help from Russia, said nothing about it. And as a result, Nixon won, as did Trump. Reagan pulled this same exact shit with members of his campaign meeting secretly with Iranian officials to delay the release of American hostages until after he won the election in exchange for a substantial supply of arms. George H.W. Bush was heavily involved in the Iran-Contra scandal as Reagan's CIA director, and once he became president, he pardoned numerous officials under investigation related to that scandal who could have also implicated him. Now, his son, George W. Bush, didn't do much better and filled his administration with former defense industry lobbyists, so by the time we were attacked on September 11th, it came as no surprise, in hindsight at least, that he launched what is now the longest war in American history. It's shit like this that Democrats, I think, just need to learn from and stop playing by the old set of rules that Republicans have long ago abandoned. If we allowed them to convince people that they are far more morally and ethically superior to Democrats without confronting them on their blatant attempts to only apply the law when it benefits them, then we shouldn't be surprised that demagogue dipshits like Trump are so successful at playing the law and order card and accusing all politicians as corrupt. Another myth that has become more prevalent lately is that Democrats have become radical or extreme left. There's a famous quote by President Harry Truman that I encourage you to look up, which basically just says, politicians have always used the term socialism as a scare word to discourage support for every major advance in society. And what these people really mean is down with progress that benefits the many at the expense of the few. Whenever I found myself in stupid Facebook arguments with folks who I'm really just kind of engaging with in order to redirect them to my web app, PolitiCube Trivia, at some point in our conversation, it always transitions to that person calling me a communist and then just walking away like they just dropped the mic and won the argument. Sometimes they'll even provide a statistic about socialism with a misspelled stat about Venezuela to try and justify their claim, but they rarely actually go into any detail about the point, and that's no coincidence. I'm not exactly surprised these folks don't know much about political science or history or even correct grammar for that matter, but the actual definition of socialism is a system of society in which the means of production are owned and controlled by the state. Today, there really is only one true socialist country, and that's North Korea. Most every other country has somewhat of a degree of capitalism, including communist countries like China. The US is a social democracy and has been for centuries. We already have socialized education through public schools, socialized medicine through the VA, Medicaid, and Medicare, and socialized infrastructure through public interstate system, just to name a few examples. Now, of these, perhaps the greatest enemy to the Republican Party is socialized medicine, which they claim will turn our healthcare system into a horrible mess. The only problem with this is it already is a mess, with Americans spending far more on healthcare than any other developed country, but with significantly poorer outcomes. As with any good lie, there's some truth to the many complaints about a single-payer, government-run healthcare system that many on the left are now embracing, but the truth is that Medicaid and Medicare are actually extremely efficient, and a quick look at the world shows that the U.S. has been far behind in providing affordable healthcare to its citizens. So it's worth considering new alternatives, yeah? I understand that most folks don't really know a lot about complex issues like healthcare, myself included for sure, but even smaller examples of socialism are often ignored or just misunderstood, much to the benefit of Republicans. For example, when I asked my friend once, who is a firefighter, about how emergency services like his, which are publicly funded, are essentially examples of socialism, and whether or not services that provide a public good where there doesn't exist a financial incentive for private competition deserve public funding, he said, of course, but then kind of refused to continue the conversation. One of my favorite authors, Robert Reich, who was the former Treasury Secretary under Bill Clinton, often says that we currently have socialism for the rich in the form of massive tax cuts and subsidies, but vulture capitalism for everyone else. This isn't a new phenomenon, though. Beginning with Ronald Reagan, we have witnessed the largest gradual redistribution of wealth from the poor and middle class to the wealthiest Americans. And I think this is something that Democrats just need to do a better job of explaining to voters, because it has been far too easy for them to use terms like entitlements and socialism and takers in order to demonize Democrats and those that we support. But even a basic investigation of those terms should make any rational person realize that they aren't so scary and only really serve as a distraction. With regards to the overall political ecosystem in the US, both parties have shifted to the right in the last 50 years, with today's mainstream Democrats essentially representing yesterday's moderate Republicans. The Republican Party has, however, shifted far more to the right than the Democratic Party. A recent study actually published this week found that the Republican Party under our current administration has become dramatically more illiberal and now more closely resembles ruling parties in autocratic societies than its former center-right equivalents in Europe. In a significant shift since 2000, the GOP as a whole has taken to demonizing and encouraging violence against its opponents and adopting tactics comparable to ruling nationalist parties in Hungary, India, Poland, and Turkey. This has also enabled outspoken conspiracy theorists to just come out of the shadows into mainstream and even be elected into office. Next Tuesday, voters in Georgia, by the way, will likely elect the first outspoken supporter of QAnon, which, for those of you who don't know, is a far-right conspiracy group that the FBI considers a source of domestic terrorism. And she has been endorsed by many Republican members of Congress. Also, she's not the only one. There are a few others running around the country who just have far less chances of winning. This dramatic shift towards the right is not unique to the US, though. In fact, over a third of the world's population now lives in nations that are becoming more autocratic. So I'm sorry if it's hard for me to accept claims that Democrats have just gone off the rails and want to replicate the dangerous socialist regimes we've seen in the past, when the truth is these kinds of attacks are only intended to distract us. The success of the GOP, in my mind, depends on their ability to maintain a misinformed voting populace and then divide us because they know the vast majority of Americans actually support measures that Democrats favor, like common sense gun reform, a pathway to citizenship, taxing the rich, even universal health care has gained in popularity. That's why they constantly make it harder for people to vote. You know, like in a democracy. There is definitely a place for conservatism within our two-party system. I just think the current Republican Party does not represent conservative values and instead represents right-wing extremism. That's why I hope the Republican Party decides to refresh itself by supporting new leadership and adopting more moderate positions, because otherwise their only option in my mind is to continue falsifying the facts in order to maintain their ever-diminishing coalition of voters. I obviously hate Donald Trump, which should be pretty apparent at this point, but I think a silver lining of his presidency is showing how important focusing on PR can be when the average person knows so little about the minute facts. My only hope is that by refocusing everyone's attention on the facts, someone like him and those who still support him will no longer be elected into office, and the rest of us can finally acknowledge which party is truly being honest.